There was a light in Daisy's drawing room, and just as he came opposite it, she heard his step, for which she had long been listening, and looked out. "Is it Georgie?" she said, knowing perfectly well that it must be. "Yes," said Georgie. "How late you are!" "And how is Lucia?" asked Daisy. Georgie quite forgot for the moment that Lucia was having complete rest. "Excellent form," he said. "Such a talk and such a music." "There you are, then," said Daisy. "There's nothing the matter with her. She doesn't want rest any more than the moon. What does it mean, Georgie? Mark my words, it means something." Lucia, indeed, seemed in no need whatever of complete rest the next day. She popped into Daisy's very soon after breakfast and asked her to be taught how to putt. Daisy gave her a demonstration and told her how to hold the putter and where to place her feet, and said it was absolutely essential to stand like a rock and to concentrate. Nobody could putt if anyone spoke. Eventually Lucia was allowed to try, and she stood all wrong and grasped her putter like an umbrella and holed out of the longest of putts in the middle of an uninterrupted sentence. Then they had a match, Daisy proposing to give her 4 strokes in the round, which Lucia refused, and Daisy, dithering with excitement and superiority, couldn't putt at all. And Lucia won easily, with Robert looking on, and she praised Daisy's putter and said it was beautifully balanced, though where she picked that up Daisy couldn't imagine. "And now I must fly," said Lucia, "and we must have a return match sometime. So amusing. I have sent for a set, and you will have to give me lessons." "Goodbye, dear Daisy. I'm away for the Sunday at dear Adele Brixton's, but after that how lovely to settle down at Risholme again. You must show me your Ouija board, too. I feel quite rested this morning. Shall I help you with the walking sticks later on?" Daisy went uneasily back to her putting. It was too awful that Lucia in that amateurish manner should have beaten a serious exponent of the art. And already, in dark anticipation, she saw Lucia as the impresario of clock golf, popularizing it in Risholme. She herself would have to learn to drive and approach without delay, and make Risholme take up real golf instead of merely putting. Lucia visited the museum next, and arranged the spit in an empty and prominent place between Daisy's fossils and Colonel Boucher's fragments of Samian ware. She attended the morning parliament on the green and walked beside Mrs. Boucher's bath chair. She shouted into Mrs. Antrobus's ear trumpet. She dallied with Piggy and Goosey, and never so much as mentioned a duchess. All her thoughts seemed wrapped up in Risholme. Just one tiresome visit lay in front of her, and then, oh, the joy of settling down here again. Even Mrs. Boucher felt disarmed, little as she would have thought it. There was something in Lucia beyond mere snobbery. Georgie popped in that afternoon about tea time. The afternoon was rather chilly, and Lucia had a fire lit in the grate of the music room, which, now that the spit had been removed, burned beautifully. Pepino, drowsy with his cold, sat by it, while the other 2 played duets. Already Lucia had taken down Sigismund's portrait and installed Georgie's watercolors again by the piano. They had had a fine tussle over the Mozart duet, and Georgie had promised to practice it, and Lucia had promised to practice it, and she had called him an idle boy, and he had called her a lazy girl, quite in the old style, while Pepino dozed. Just then, the evening post came in, with the evening paper, and Lucia picked up the latter to see what Hermione had said about her departure from London. Even as she turned back the page, her eye fell on 2 or 3 letters which had been forwarded from Brompton Square. The top one was a large square envelope, the sort of fine thick envelope that contained a rich card of invitation, and she opened it. Next moment she sprang from her seat. "Pepino, dear," she cried. "Marsha, her ball. Marsha's ball tonight." Roused himself a little. "Ball? What ball?" he said. "No ball. Riz home." Lucia pushed by Georgie on the treble music stool without seeming to notice that he was there. "No, dear, of course you won't go," she said, "but do you know? I think I shall go up and pop in for an hour. Georgie will come to dine with you, won't you, Georgie? And you'll go to bed early, 6:30. Yes, I can be in town by 10. That will be heaps of time. I shall dress at Brompton Square. Just a sandwich to take with me and eat it in the car." She wheeled round to Georgie, pressing the bell in her circumvolution. "Marsha Whitby," she said, "winding up the season. So easy to pop up there, and dear Marsha would be hurt if I didn't come. Let me see, shall I come back tomorrow, Pepino? Perhaps it would be simpler if I stayed up there and sent the car back. Then you could come up in comfort next day, and we would go on to Adele's together. I have a host of things to do in London tomorrow. That party at Aggie's. I will telephone to Aggie to say that I can come after all. My maid, my chauffeur," she said to the butler, rather in the style of Shylock. "I want my maid and my chauffeur and my car. Let him have his dinner quickly. No, he can get his dinner at Brompton Square. Tell him to come round at once." Georgie sat positively aghast, for Lucia ran on like a thing demented. Mozart, Ouija, putting, the Elizabethan spit, all the simple joys of Risholme fizzled out like damp fireworks. Gone, too, utterly gone was her need of complete rest. She had never been so full of raw, blatant, savage vitality. "Dear Marsha," she said, "I felt it must be an oversight from the first. But naturally, Georgie, though she and I are such friends, I could not dream of reminding her. What a blessing that my delicious day at Risholme has so rested me. I feel I could go to 50 balls without fatigue. Such a wonderful house, Georgie. When you come up to stay with us in the autumn, I must take you there. Pepino, is it not lucky that I only brought down here just enough for a couple of nights, and left everything in London to pick up as we came through to go to Adele's? What a sight it will be! All the royal family almost, I believe. And the whole of the diplomatic corps. My Gioconda, I know, is going. Not a large ball, though, at all. Not one of those great promiscuous affairs which I hate so. How dear Marsha was besieged for invitations. How vulgar people are, and how pushing. Goodbye. Mind you practice your Mozart, Georgie. Oh, and tell Daisy that I shan't be able to have another of those delicious puddings with her tomorrow. Back on Tuesday, after the weekend at Adele's, and then weeks and weeks of dear Risholme. How long they are. I will just go and hurry my maid up." Georgie tripped off as soon as she had gone to see Daisy, and narrated to her open-mouthed disgust this amazing scene. "And the question is," he said, "about the complete rest that was ordered her? I don't believe she was ordered any rest at all. I believe Daisy gave a triumphant crow. Inductive reasoning had led her to precisely the same point at precisely the same moment. Why, of course, she said, I always felt there was something behind that complete rest. I told you it meant something different. She wasn't asked. And so she came down here for a rest," said Georgie in a loud voice. He was determined to bring that out first. "Because she wasn't asked." "And the moment she was asked, she flew," said Daisy. "Nothing could be plainer. No more rest, thank you." "She's wonderful," said Georgie. "Too interesting." Lucia spent through the summer evening on this errand of her own reprieve, too excited to eat and too happy to wonder how it had happened like this. How wise, too, she had been to hold her tongue and give way to no passionate laments at her exclusion from the paradise towards which she was now hastening. Not one word of abuse had she uttered against Marsha. She had asked nobody to intercede. She had joined in all the talk about the ball as if she was going, and finally had made it impossible for herself to go by announcing that she had been ordered a few days of complete rest. She could and would explain her appearance perfectly. She had felt much better. Doctors were such fussers. And at the last moment had made just a little effort, and here she was. A loud explosion interrupted these agreeable reflections, and the car drew up. A tire had burst, but they carried an extra wheel, and though the delay seemed terribly long, they were soon on their way again. They traversed another 10 miles, and now in the northeast, the smoldering glow of London reddened the toneless hue of the summer night. The stars burned bright, and she pictured Pepino at his telescope. No, Pepino had a really bad cold and would not be at his telescope. Then there came another explosion. Was it those disgusting stars in their courses that were fighting against her? And again the car drew up by the side of the empty road. "What has happened?" asked Lucia in a strangled voice. "Another tire gone, ma'am," said the chauffeur. "Never knew such a thing." Lucia looked at her clock. It was 10 already, and she ought now to be in Brompton Square. There was no further wheel that could be put on, and the tire had to be taken off and mended. The minutes passed like seconds. Lucia, outwardly composed, sat on a rug at the edge of the road and tried unsuccessfully not to curse Almighty Providence. The moon rose like a gelatine lozenge. She began to count the hours that intervened between the tragic present and, say, 4 o'clock in the morning, and she determined that whatever further disasters might befall, she would go to Whitby House, even if it was in a dustman's cart. So long as there was a chance of a single guest being left there, she would go. And all the time, if she had only known it, the stars were fighting not against her, but for her. The tire was mended, and she got to Brompton Square at exactly 11:15. The cupboards were torn open, drawers ransacked. Her goaded maid burst into tears. Aunt Amy's pearls were clasped around her neck. Pepino's hair in the shrine of gold sausage that had once been Beethoven's was pinned on, and at 12 she hurried up the great stairs at Whitby House. Precisely as she came to the door of the ballroom, there emerged the head of the procession, going down to supper. Marsha, for a moment, stared at her as if she was a ghost. But Lucia was so busy curtsying that she gave no thought to that. 7 times in rapid succession did she curtsy. It almost became a habit, and she nearly curtsied to Adele, who, so like Adele, followed immediately after. "Just up from Risholme, dearest Adele," she said. "I felt quite rested. How are you, Lord Tony?" And so I made a little effort. Pepino urged me to come. "How nice to see your Excellency. Millie, dearest Olga, what a lot of friends. How is poor Princess Isabel? Marsha looked so handsome. Brilliant, such a delicious drive. I felt I had to pop in." Chapter 9. Poor Pepino's cold next day, instead of being better, was a good deal worse. He had aches and pains and felt feverish, and sent for the doctor, who peremptorily ordered him to go to bed. There was nothing in the least to cause alarm, but it would be the height of folly to go to any weekend party at all. Bed. Pepino telegraphed to Lady Brixton with many regrets for the unavoidable, and rang up Lucia. The state of his voice made it difficult to catch what he said, but she quite understood that there was nothing to be anxious about, and that he hoped she would go to Adele's without him. Her voice, on the other hand, was marvelously distinct, and he heard a great deal about the misfortunes which had come to so brilliant a conclusion last night. There followed a string of 7 Christian names, and Lucia said a flashlight photograph had been permitted during supper. She thought she was in it, though rather in the background. Lucia was very sorry for Pepino's indisposition, but, as ordered, had no anxiety about him. She felt, too, that He wouldn't personally miss very much by being prevented from coming to Adele's party, for it was to be a very large party, and Pepino, bless him, occasionally got a little dazed at these brilliant gatherings. He did not grasp who people were with the speed and certainty which were needful, and he had been known to grasp the hand of an eminent author and tell him how much he had admired his fine picture at the Academy. Lucia constantly did that sort of thing herself, but then she got herself out of the hole she had herself digged with so brilliant a maneuver that it didn't matter, whereas Pepino was only dazed the more by his misfortunes. Moreover, she knew that Pepino's presence somehow hampered her style. She could not be the brilliant mondaine when his patient but proud eye was on her, with quite the dash that was hers when he was not there. There was always the sense that he knew her best in her Risholm incarnation, in her duets with Georgie, and her rendering of the slow movement of the Moonlight Sonata, and her grabbing of all Daisy's little stunts. She electrified him as the superb butterfly, but the electrification was accompanied by slight shocks and surprises. When she referred by her Christian name to some woman with whom her only bond was that she had refused to dine at Brompton Square, that puzzled Pepino. In the autumn she must be a little more serious, have some quiet dinner parties of ordinary people, for really up till now there had scarcely been an ordinary person at Brompton Square at all. Such noble lions of every species had been entrapped there. And Adele's party was to be of a very leonine kind. The smart world was to be there, and some highbrows, and some politicians, and she was aware that she herself would have to do her very best, and be elusive, and pretend to know what she didn't know, and seem to swim in very distinguished currents. Dear Pepino wasn't up to that sort of thing. He couldn't grapple with it, and she grappled with it best without him. At the moment of that vainglorious thought, it is probable that Nemesis fixed her inexorable eye on Lucia. Lucia, unconscious of this deadly scrutiny, turned to her immediate affairs. Her engagement book pleasantly informed her that she had many things to do on the day when the need for complete rest overtook her, and now she heralded through the telephone the glad tidings that she could lunch here and drop in there and dine with Aggie. All went well with these restorations, and the day would be full, and tomorrow also, down to the hour of her departure for Adele's. Having dispatched this agreeable business, she was on the point of ringing up Stephen to fit him in for the spare 3/4 of an hour that was left, when she was rung up, and it was Stephen's voice that greeted her. "Stefano mio," she said, "how did you guess I was back?" "Because I rang up Risholm first," said he, "and heard you had gone to town. Were you there last night?" There was no cause to ask where "there" was. There had only been one place in London last night. "Yes, delicious dance," said Lucia. "I was just going to ring you up and see if you could come around for a chat at 4:45. I am free till 5:30. Such fun it was. A flashlight photograph." "No," said Stephen in the Risholm manner. "I long to hear about it. And were there really 7 of them?" "Quite," said Lucia magnificently. "Wonderful. But 4:45 is no use for me. Can't you give me another time?" "My dear, impossible," said Lucia. "You know what London is in these last days. Such a scrimmage." "Well, we shall meet tomorrow then," said he. "But alas, I go to Adele's tomorrow," she said. "Yes, but so do I," said Stephen. "She asked me this morning. I was wondering if you would drive me down if you're going in your car. Would there be room for you and Pepino and me?" Lucia rapidly reviewed the situation. It was perfectly clear to her that Adele had asked Stephen at the last moment to fill Pepino's place. But naturally she had not told him that, and Lucia determined not to do so either. It would spoil his pleasure. At least it would have spoiled hers, to know that. And what a wonderful entry it would make for her, rather daring, to drive down alone with her lover. She could tell him about Pepino's indisposition tomorrow, as if it had just occurred. "Yes, Stefano, heaps of room," she said, delighted. "I'll call for you, shall I, on my way down, soon after 3. "Angelic," he said, "what fun we shall have." And it is probable that Nemesis at that precise moment licked her dry lips. Fun, thought Nemesis. Marsha Whitby was of the party. She went down in the morning and lunched alone with Adele. Their main topic of conversation was obvious. "I saw her announcement in the Morning Post," said the infuriated Marsha, "that she had gone for a few days' complete rest into the country, and naturally I thought I was safe. I was determined she shouldn't come to my ball, and when I saw that, I thought she couldn't. So, out of sheer good nature, I sent her a card so that she could tell everybody she had been asked. Never did I dream that there was a possibility of her coming, instead of which she made the most conspicuous entry that she could have made. I believe she timed it. I believe she waited on the stairs till she saw we were going down to supper." "I wonder," said Adele. "Genius, if it was that. She curtsied 7 times, too. I can't do that without loud cracks from my aged knees." "And she stopped till the very end," said Marsha. "She was positively the last to go. I shall never do a kind thing again." "You're horrid about her," said Adele. "Besides, what has she done? You asked her, and she came. You don't rave at your guests for coming when they're asked. You wouldn't like it if none of them came." "That's different," said Marsha. "I shouldn't wonder if she announced she was ordered complete rest in order that I should fall into her trap." Adele sighed, but shook her head. "Oh, my dear, that would have been magnificent," she said. "But I'm afraid I can't hope to believe that. I dare say she went into the country because you hadn't asked her, and that was pretty good. But the other, no. However, we'll ask Tony what he thinks." "What's Tony got to do with it?" said Marsha. "Why, he's even more wrapped up in her than I am," said Adele. "He thinks of nothing else." Marsha was silent a moment. Then a sort of softer gleam came into her angry eye. "Tell me some more about her," she said. Adele clapped her hands. "Ah, that's splendid," she said. "You're beginning to feel kinder. What we would do without our Lucia, I can't imagine. I don't know what there would be to talk about." "She's ridiculous," said Marsha, relapsing a little. "No, you mustn't feel that," said Adele. "You mustn't laugh at her ever. You must just richly enjoy her." "She's a snob," said Marsha, as if this was a tremendous discovery. "So am I. So are you. So are we all," said Adele. "We all run after distinguished people like Alf and Marcel. The difference between you and Lucia is entirely in her favor, for you pretend you're not a snob, and she is perfectly frank and open about it. Besides, what is a duchess like you for except to give pleasure to snobs? That's your work in the world, darling. That's why you were sent here. Don't shirk it, or when you're old you will suffer agonies of remorse. And you're a snob, too. You liked having 7, or was it 70, royals at your dance." "Well, tell me some more about Lucia," said Marsha, rather struck by this ingenious presentation of the case. "Indeed, I will. I long for your conversion to Lucia Fealism. Now, today there are going to be marvelous happenings. You see, Lucia has got a lover." "Quite absolutely impossible," said Marsha firmly. "Oh, don't interrupt. Of course he is only an official lover, a public lover, and his name is Stephen Meriel. A perfect lady. Now, Pepino, Lucia's husband, was coming down with her today, but he's got a very bad cold and has put me off. I'm rather glad. Lucia has got more dash when he's not there, so I've asked her lover instead." "No," said Marsha. "Go on." "My dear, They are much better than any play I have ever seen. They do it beautifully. They give each other little glances and smiles, and then begin to talk hurriedly to someone else. Of course they're both as chaste as snow. Chaster, if possible. I think poor Bab's case put it into Lucia's head that in this naughty world it gave a cachet to a woman to have the reputation of having a lover. So safe, too. There's nothing to expose. They only behave like lovers strictly in public. I was terrified when it began that Mr. Mariol would think she meant something and try to kiss her when they were alone and so rub the delicate bloom completely off. But I'm sure he's tumbled to it. How perfect, said Marsha. Isn't it? Aren't you feeling more Lucia-phile? I'm sure you are. You must enjoy her. It shows such a want of humor to be annoyed with her. And really, I've taken a great deal of trouble to get people she will revel in. There's the Prime Minister. There's you. There's Greatorex, the pianist, who's the only person who can play Stravinsky. There's Professor Bonstetter, the psychoanalyst. There's the Italian ambassador. There's her lover. There's Tony. I can't go on. Oh, and I must remember to tell her that Archie Singleton is Bab's brother, or she may say something dreadful. And then there are lots who will revel in Lucia, and I the foremost. I'm devoted to her. I am really, Marsha. She's got character. She's got an iron will. And I like strong, talkative women so much better than strong, silent men. Yes, she's got will, said Marsha. She determined to come to my ball, and she came. I allow I gave her the chance. Those are the chances that come to gifted people, said Adele. They don't come to ordinary people. Suppose I flirted violently with her lover, said Marsha. Adele's eyes grew bright with thought. I can't imagine what she would do, she said, but I'm sure she would do something that scored. Otherwise, she wouldn't be Lucia. But you mustn't do it. Just one evening, said Marsha, just for an hour or two. It's not poaching, you see, because her lover isn't her lover. He's just a stunt. Adele wavered. It would be wonderful to know what she would do, she said, and it's true that he's only a stunt. Perhaps for an hour or two tomorrow, and then give him back. Adele did not expect any of her guests till tea time, and Marsha and she both retired for after-lunch siestas. Adele had been down here for the last 4 or 5 days, driving up to Marsha's ball and back in the very early morning, and had 3 days before settled everything in connection with her party, assigning rooms, discussing questions of high importance with her chef, and arranging to meet as many trains as possible. It so happened, therefore, that Stephen Mariol, since the house was full, was to occupy the spacious dressing-room furnished as a bedroom next Lucia's room, which had been originally allotted to Pepino. Adele had told her butler that Mr. Lucas was not coming, but that his room would be occupied by Mr. Mariol, thought no more about it, and omitted to substitute a new card on his door. These 2 rooms were halfway down a long corridor of bedrooms and bathrooms that ran the whole length of the house, a spacious oak-boarded corridor, rather dark, with the broad staircase coming up at the end of it. Below was the suite of public rooms, a library at the end, a big music room, a long gallery of a drawing room, and the dining room. These all opened onto a paved terrace overlooking the gardens and tennis courts, and it was here, with the shadow of the house lying coolly across it, that her guests began to assemble. In ones and twos they gathered, some motoring down from London, others arriving by train, and it was not till there were some dozen of them, among whom were the most fervent Lucia-philes, that the object of their devotion, attended by her lover, made her appearance, evidently at the top of her form. "Dearest Adele," she said, "how delicious to get into the cool country again. Marsha, dear, such adventures I had on my way up to your hall. 2 burst tires. I thought I should never get there. How are you, Your Excellency? I saw you at the Duchess's, but couldn't get a word with you. Aggie, darling. Ah, Lord Tony. Yes, a cup of tea would be delicious. No sugar, Stephen, thanks. Lucia had not noticed quite everybody. There were one or two people rather retired from the tea table, but they did not seem to be of much importance, and certainly the Prime Minister was not among them. Stephen hovered, lover-like, just behind her chair, and she turned to the Italian ambassador. I was afraid of a motor accident all the way down, she said, because last night I dreamed I broke a looking-glass. Quaint things dreams are, though really the psychoanalysts who interpret them are quainter. I went to a meeting at Sophie's, dear Sophie Ellingsby, the other day. Your Excellency, I am sure, knows Sophie Ellingsby, and heard a lecture on it. Let me see. Boiled rabbit. If you dream of boiled rabbit. Lucia suddenly became aware of a sort of tension. Just a tension. She looked quickly round and recognized one of the men she had not paid much attention to. She sprang from her chair. Professor Bonstetter, she said, how are you? I know you won't remember me, but I did have the honor of shaking hands with you after your enthralling lecture the other day. Do come and tell His Excellency and me a little more about it. There were so many questions I longed to ask you. Adele wanted to applaud, but she had to be content with catching Marcia's eye. Was Lucia great, or was she not? Stephen, too. How exactly right she was to hand him her empty cup when she had finished with it, and without a word, and how perfectly he took it. More, he said, and Lucia just shook her head without withdrawing her attention from Professor Bonstetter. Then the Prime Minister arrived, and she said how lovely Checkers must be looking. She did not annex him, and she just hovered and hinted, and made no direct suggestion, and sure enough, within 5 minutes he had asked her if she knew Checkers. Of course she did, but only as a tourist, and so one thing led to another. It would be a nice break in her long drive down to Rizzle on Tuesday, to lunch at Checkers, and not more than 40 miles out of her way. People dispersed and strolled on the terrace, and gathered again, and some went off to their rooms. Lucia had one little turn up and down with the ambassador, and spoke with great tact of Mussolini, and another with Lord Tony, and not for a long time did she let Stephen join her. But then they wandered off into the garden, and were seen standing very close together and arguing publicly about a flower, and Lucia, seeing they were observed, called to Adele to know if it wasn't Dropmore Borage. They came back very soon, and Stephen went up to his room while Lucia remained downstairs. Adele showed her the library and the music room and the long drawing room, and then vanished. Lucia gravitated to the music room, opened the piano, and began the slow movement of the Moonlight Sonata. About halfway through it, she became aware that somebody had come into the room, but her eyes were fixed dreamily on the usual point at the edge of the ceiling, and her fingers faultlessly doled out the slow triplets. She gave a little sigh when she had finished, pressed her fingers to her eyes, and slowly awoke, as from some melodious anesthetic. It was a man who had come in, and who had seated himself not far from the keyboard. "Charming," he said. "Thank you." Lucia didn't remember seeing him on the terrace. Perhaps he had only just arrived. She had a vague idea, however, that whether on the terrace or elsewhere, she had seen him before. She gave a pretty little start. "Ah, had no idea I had an audience," she said. "I should never have ventured to go on playing. So dreadfully out of practice." "Please have a little more practice, then," said the polite stranger. She ran her hands butterfly fashion over the keys. "A little morsel of Stravinsky," she said. It was in the middle of the morsel that Adele came in and found Lucia playing Stravinsky to Mr. Greatorex. The position seemed to be away beyond her orbit altogether, and she merely waited, with undiminished faith in Lucia, to see what would happen when Lucia became aware to whom she was playing. It was a longish morsel, too, more like a meal than a morsel, and it was also remarkably like a muddle. Finally, Lucia made an optimistic attempt at the double chromatic scale in divergent directions, which brought it to an end, and laughed gaily. "My poor fingers," she said. "Delicious piano, dear Adele. I love a Bergstein." That was a little morsel of Stravinsky. Hectic, perhaps, do you think? But so true to the modern idea. Little feverish excursions, little bits of tunes, and nothing worked out. But I always say that there is something in Stravinsky, if you study him. How I worked at that little piece, and I'm afraid it's far from perfect yet. Lucia played one more little run with her right hand, while she cudgeled her brain to remember where she had seen this man before, and turned around on the music stool. She felt sure he was an artist of some kind, and she did not want to ask Adele to introduce him, for that would look as if she did not know everybody. She tried pictures next. "In art, I always think that the Stravinsky school is represented by the post-cubists," she said. "They give us pattern in lines, just as Stravinsky gives us patterns in notes, and the modern poet patterns in words. At Sophie Allingsby's the other night we had a feast of patterns. Dear Sophie, what a curious mixture of tastes. She cares only for the ultra-primitive in music and the ultra-modern in art. Just before you came in, Adele, I was trying to remember the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight. Those triplets, though they look easy, have to be kept so level. And yet Sophie considers Beethoven a positive decadent. I ought to have taken her to Diva's little concert. Diva Dalrymple. For I assure you, really, that Stravinsky sounded classical compared to the rest of the program. It was very creditably played, too, what was his name? Mr. Greatorex?" She had actually said the word before her brain made the connection. She gave her little peal of laughter. "Ah, you wicked people," she cried. "A plot, clearly a plot, Mr. Greatorex. How could you? Adele told you to come in here when she heard me begin my little strummings, and told you to sit down and encourage me. Don't deny it, Adele. I know it was like that. I shall tell everybody how unkind you've been. Unless Mr. Greatorex sits down instantly and magically restores to life what I have just murdered." Adele denied nothing. In fact, there was no time to deny anything, for Lucia positively thrusts Mr. Greatorex onto the music stool and instantly put on her rapt musical face, chin in hand, and eyes looking dreamily upwards. There was Nemesis, you would have thought, dealing thrusts at her, but Nemesis was no match for her amazing quickness. She parried and thrust again, and here, what richness of future reminiscence, was Mr. Greatorex playing Stravinsky to her, before no audience but herself and Adele, who really didn't count, for the only tune she liked was Land of Hope and Glory. Great was Lucia. Adele left the two, warning them that it was getting on for dressing time, but there was some more Stravinsky first, for Lucia's sole ear. Adele had told her the direction of her room and said her name was on the door, and Lucia found it at once. A beautiful room it was, with a bathroom on one side and a magnificent Charles II bed draped at the back with woodwork tapestry. It was a little late for Lucia's Elizabethan taste, and she noticed that the big wardrobe was Chippendale, which was later still. There was a Chinese paper on the wall and fine Persian rugs on the floor, and though she could easily have criticized, it was easy to admire. And there for herself was a very smart dress, and for decoration, Aunt Amy's pearls and the Beethoven brooch. But she decided to avoid all possible chance of competition and put the pearls back into her jewel case. The Beethoven brooch, she was sure, need fear no rival.